over to them. And for each person, a reminder, I ask you to speak for or make comments for about 2 minutes leading up to a question for either or both of our speakers. All right, with that, I'm going to turn things over to you, David, for your question.
Thank you very much, Josh. You did sound like you were tuning a guitar. I hope that I'm coming through more clearly. I'd like to have a quick question on the very tail end of Mr. Kaegi's presentation, and that relates to apartments. As you all know, Community and Voice in particular is interested in diversity, including income diversity. Although it's not fair to say that all renters are lower income than others, I think it's fair to say that homeowners typically have higher incomes than renters. It sounds as if because the large apartments are included under industrial, their assessed tax rate is at 25% of market value rather than 10. So, and again, I see Ali shaking his head. So I'd like you to clarify this.
Yeah,
again,
sure.
keep in mind how apartments are treated with, again, the issue of tax fairness and, and income distribution. Just
Sure.
one last thing, just before you start. I did check earlier today. According to the Census Bureau, owner-occupied homes in Oak Park are just under 60%. So that means roughly 40% of the population in Oak Park are renters. So it's a sizable number.
Yes.
You get the idea. Clarify things for me.
Sure. So actually, apartments are residential, and so the terminology is a little bit confusing. So they are assessed at 10% of market value. All apartments, just like
even though they're included in the commercial,
just like single-family homes, but they are true. They are the thing that's a little bit funky about them is the bigger apartment buildings are valued in terms of how do you estimate market value in the same kind of way that you might estimate office space, or because they earn rent. And so the apartment building 7 units or above, we value them using a income approach, how much rent they earn. For the 2 and 6 flats, there are so many transactions in them that we can value them per unit in the similar way that we would value houses. So, and actually the market also discriminates between those 2 kinds of properties in the same way. And you make a very good point. The 2 to 6 units are actually, if you look at past cycles, are a little bit more vulnerable, more economically sensitive to changes in the economy than bigger institutional apartment buildings will be in terms of how they trade in the market. I think that might have to do with the fact that 2 to 6 flats are typically run by mom and pops. Typically might have a tenant that's a little bit more economically sensitive, vulnerable to unemployment, lower income, more expensive to run. You don't have an elevator typically in a 2 to 6 flat. You sometimes don't have AC. So a lower value per unit too. And what I wanted to do was actually, if I could show, again, I'm going to share my screen. We made adjustments to those 2 to 6 flats down actually a little bit bigger than single family homes. So across the south suburbs for COVID, between 10 and 15%. If you went into Oak Park, you would see that for the 2 to 6 flats, we made an adjustment somewhere between 10 and 11%. And the reason why is when we look at past cycles, typically on the down cycle, 2 to 6 flats are hit more than a single family home. We did this in conjunction with some research at at DePaul. So that's fundamentally what happens in the market. The other thing to know is, where did we systemically value these? Where were these properties systemically valued before our administration came in? And we find much more systemic undervaluation in the larger apartment buildings, more than 7 units, than in the 2 to 6 flats, which were pretty close to the mark before. So the change that you see is, we think, correcting undervaluation on the larger apartment buildings. You know, the most extreme example would be like the Vantage or the Emerson, but there are lots of other buildings. Does that answer your question, David?
It does. Thank you. And just a real quick follow-up, if you don't mind, Josh, if this is all right.
Yes.
Again, putting myself in the position of a renter, and I'm not, is there much of the discussion relating to assessed values and so on relates to accuracy and so on? How would a renter know if his or her building is assessed well, and to what degree, if there's a change in the assessed value, might a renter think that their rent would be affected by a change in the assessed value? And I know that's a little bit outside your scope, but perhaps you might have some insights that might be of interest to the community.
Well, so David, the first thing that a person can do is go to our website. So I will again demonstrate on our website. So take control of the screen. So if we go to cookcountyassessor.com, if you haven't had a chance to check out our website, please do. We changed it this year, and there are lots of bells and whistles for you. If you go down, you can search by address.
Okay.
Put in your address, see how the building's assessed, and it'll tell you what market value we assumed. And then furthermore, after you've done that, you can go to the community data section of the website. So community data overview. Then you look at all the different community reports, and you can find Oak Park. Then you can go into the different sections. In this case, it's a little bit confusing because you have to go to the commercial report where the apartment buildings are.
Mm-hmm.
You open that up, and then you can see how we valued apartment buildings.
Okay.
And you can see what we assumed. So there are 357 7-unit or above apartment buildings. Here's where we talk about what went into our assumptions about apartments. So you would locate the apartment that you're in and look for the rent per unit in your building. You can see which classification we go in. If it's this level, we put it in this institutional class. So these are the biggest, highest end buildings that, Goldman Sachs owns the Vantage. So that's like, institutional. But smaller, a courtyard apartment building that might be 100 years old, it might be in regional or neighborhood, depending on the size that it has and the rent the rent per unit. And then you would look at, you would do a calculation, look at the rent, calculate the number of units there, put in a vacancy rate, and add an expense ratio, and you come up with operating it. You could run through all the math yourself if you wanted to, and then locate it. Or you could just see what's the value per unit as a shortcut to come up with the valuation and see how it is. Now, the last thing I'd mention, David, I'm going to stop the screen share here. The last thing is that, so my old job, I was in the private sector. I was a portfolio manager, went to business school. Standard economic theory would say that if you own an apartment building or any other commercial building, you will rent it out at the rent at which you are maximizing your profit. So you will get the best rent you can on the units you have at risk of some kind of vacancy rate. And then you will run it as hard as you can to maximize your income. What tax you pay does not change that calculation. If you're paying zero tax, you're still going to maximize the rent that you can get for your building. If you're paying more tax, it's not going to change your behavior there.
I'm going to chime in and suggest that a discussion of basic economic principles and theories might be beyond the scope for tonight.
All right, I was just I think it's a good reminder.
Thank you very much. I'm done.
All right,
Jeff, you mind if I just say something about it? I would have a perspective. You know, my father was invested in apartment buildings, so I have didn't go to business school, but I am familiar with that a little bit. I would just say two things in response to what David asked. Number one, when I was shaking your head when you were talking about whether apartments are assessed at 25%, there was a time when apartment buildings were assessed at a much higher percentage than they are right now. And so you may have been thinking about that prior time. That all changed starting in 2002, I think. And it changed because there was a time when we assessed apartment buildings at a much higher level of value than condo buildings. And so that was part of the reason why we had a lot of condo conversions, because there was a tax advantage to making that change. One thing I would say is that, you know, for the larger apartment buildings, there have been some pretty hefty assessment increases. As I looked at it, I thought, you know, at the reassessment before the COVID adjustments, they were around 100% or something like that. And so when Fritz was earlier talking about the adjustments in terms of the overall share of the tax burden going down for residential and going up for commercial, a big part of the reason is the increases in the large apartment building valuations. Now that, you know, just from an operator standpoint, I think if you have a significant tax increase in a place like Oak Park, taxes are a pretty big percentage of any property owner's expenses. If they go up dramatically, I think that is going to put upward pressure, you know, on operations or on people who, you know, people are going to try to increase rents if they can, because they may, you know, if it goes up dramatically. One of the things I've found in property taxes generally, whether you're an apartment or building owner, a homeowner, or a commercial owner, is people like stability. And, you know, if the taxes go up dramatically in 1 year, that creates some disruption. So, you know, we'll have to see. There's also another round of appeals. So, you know, Fritz has got his first numbers, he puts out numbers, and then the board of review looks at them again. So in my experience, a lot of times the board of review and the assessor are not always on the same page in terms of valuation. So we'll see how it ends up.
Well, and
Thank you very much.
that is a good point. And I just thought I'd add one more thing to that. So here's what, if you're scoring this at home, everybody, this is the thing that you should think about. So assessed value total in Oak Park in 2020 is $848 million. This will be reduced by the COVID adjustments that we made. So, you know, think about your assessment is that share of 848 minus the COVID adjustment. And then the board of review, because they take appeals, there will be some value that will be decreased there. And every decrease that they make makes your rate go up. So you should keep an eye on and see how much, if assessments are cut for things like the Vantage, see how big those are, because if big buildings get their assessments cut, that means your share of the pie grows. And the key is how accurate are we being, and then what are appeals taking things where market value is, or are they taking it away from market value? I think all of us as citizens should keep an eye on that.
Great, thank you very much for those questions and answers. I'd like to move on to Gary, and Gary, you have a question, I think, as well.
Actually, I promised Josh that I was going to try to answer one fairly complex question for Mr. Kaegi quickly, but everybody knows I'm not terse. So there was a clarification I was going to ask from Ali. When you had your spreadsheets or slides showing $18 million from the TIFs expiring, and you kept referring that to as existing buildings and new buildings, I want to clarify that isn't the $18 million from all of the increases that have accrued in the TIF on old and new buildings? since the inception of the TIF?
Yes,
You're
that's right.
giving the impression that this $18 million came from the new high-rises and the other subsidized development. I don't think that's true.
No, that's true. And if I gave a misimpression, I'm trying to make a complicated topic simple. But you are absolutely right. Under the TIF, it's the increase in value in the TIF for downtown since what, 1983, I think.
Yes.
Now, some of that is new buildings, and some of that is just normal increase in values of existing buildings. What I was trying to make a distinction between was, the properties outside of the TIF, had smaller increases because the revenue from the TIF that used to go to a TIF district now is suddenly coming into the school districts and everything, and they're able to collect more money, but the increase in what people are paying is not as much because of the TIF.
You know this because we've had this discussion, that there has been an argument as to whether the TIF expenditures produce a great deal more increment than all of the changes that happened in the world since 1983. And nobody has ever been able to really prove that the TIF actually made us money. Is that a valid thing to say?
The TIFs have been a controversial feature in Oak Park. So certainly, we once had a mall, and then we once had a street on Lake Street, and then we put a mall, and we took it out. Was that making us any money?
Some of those were pre-TIF, though.
What's that?
Some of that, I think, putting them all in was pre-TIF.
Yes,
I think it's before 83. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. But taking it out, I don't know that taking it out necessarily made us money. Maybe it did. But I think that it's the difficult thing about TIFs is you always have to figure out where would we be without it. We'd have to create this Star Trek-like alternative universe to see where we'd be. And sometimes it's hard to know. But I would say there have certainly been examples over the years where we have had private development without any public money, having built properties outside of TIF district. And it does raise questions like if, we're talking about downtown Oak Park, prominent places in the community, are we saying that really the only way we can get development there is by giving some sort of government help? Sometimes I think it's a legitimate question to see whether that's really the case.
I won't be late. Go ahead.
Oh, Gary, so, I think an important example would be a lot of the tall buildings that have been built in Oak Park have been within the TIF. And then when the TIF expired, they were added to the base that we have. So conceivably, it can lower the rate for everyone.
The question is simply whether or not those would have been built. In
That's
1983,
Yes.
Oak Park, if I talk to somebody in real estate or development, they'd say, Oak Park, how bad has it gotten? And by the early 90s, Oak Park was now a trendy place, and it's a place where people wanted to live, new urbanism, old urbanism, all of that stuff.
Yep.
And I'm wondering how much of that would have been built without some of the subsidies.
These are very good questions to ask.
And remember, the TIF law talks about addressing blight. And
Right.
it's hard to say that either
Right.
LaSalle Street in Chicago or downtown Oak Park was
Yeah.
blighted.
100%. I think, the thing with the TIF equation is always there is a long period where there is, in the best of scenarios, a certain amount of assessed value growth that is taken off the table for everyone in the community. And at the expiration, that base is added back in, plus any tax surplus revenues from the TIF that are
I do want to ask my more complex question, but I just want to raise the point that we're talking $223 million in levy, and we're saying what's been claimed for each of these 21-story buildings is that they will add $1 million roughly in taxes. So we're talking about each of these buildings being 1/2 of 1%, perhaps, of the total levy. And that means, as Ali once said in a nice article for the paper, you'd have to build an awful lot of them to have the taxes go down.
Well, yeah, I remember I once found that the Sears Tower, now the Willis Tower, I once looked at their bill, which was $35 million. So, if we build a Sears Tower or Willis Tower, we'd probably see our taxes go down. But some of these smaller buildings, relatively speaking,
And I think you said that at the time that if you built the Sears Tower, the taxes might go down for 5 years.
Well, and Gary, I could give you a really good example. So actually, the Vantage was purchased by Goldman Sachs like just a couple of years ago for $100 million. So that's a pretty good number. And the Vantage also, their mortgage is a public record because it's part of a commercial mortgage-backed security. So they told their lenders it was worth a little bit more than that. So those are two pretty good data points. So if just say they're valued at $100 million, then their assessed value would be $10 million. Okay, so assessed value of $10 million on a huge building like the Vantage. Compare that to about 850 million of assessed value total in Oak Park. That gives you a reasonable idea, like how many Vantages do you need to really move the dial on assessed value?
I don't want to monopolize your time with this, but my other question was that we have a lot of persistent retail vacancies, and a lot of them are in new expensive retail buildings, in some of the new high-rises and such. And what I am, being simple-minded and not an economist, I would say, gee, if somebody is asking $30 a square foot and it stands vacant for 5 years, why don't they take whatever they can get? And what I've been told is they don't, because they then go to the assessment process and say, I can't rent this. My income is down, so knock my assessment down. And it seems to be possible for someone to come out ahead by leaving the space vacant and getting the tax cut more than taking a lower rent, which reduces the revenue to the municipalities, makes everybody else pay more, and leaves us with these vacant retail gaps.
You got that right, Gary. That was the game.
Okay.
You could leave a building vacant and get your assessment reduced by up to 90% in the past. Shockingly.
And you changed that.
Yes, we have. That game is done. So we introduced a new vacancy policy this summer, which is based on, first of all, we value every property using a certain amount of vacancy in our market rate of vacancy, which we publish. And then if people are asking for additional credit for vacancy, we give them credit for a fraction of the vacancy that they report, and it's limited in period of time. Because that reflects what other, assessment jurisdictions in Illinois and in the rest of the country do. Because if you leave a building 100% vacant, that does not mean its value decreases 90% in the market. Doing this is for good valuation practice, and it's also good community social practice for the reasons you mentioned. We want the vitality on the streets. We want to encourage, we don't want to penalize the people who work hard to keep spaces occupied and reward people who keep things vacant. We want sales tax revenues to take some of the load off of property tax revenues. We want the employment in the community, and we want the vitality that makes places like Oak Park unique.
I'm not sure I remember how long the southwest corner of Euclid and Lake Street has been vacant, but it's been the bulk of the time that it's been standing. So that must be for a different reason.
I'm going to interrupt here. It's a very important, interesting topic, but I think I want to make sure we have time to hear from other panelists as well. But I think we got a very good and encouraging answer, actually, to that important question. I'm going to turn things next to you, Elizabeth, to Betsy, and have you ask your question? Not hearing you right now.
Me?
There we go.
You hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
My question is for Mr. Kaegi. That report that you showed us on residential assessments for 2020, I went over the report, and those statistics which you mentioned about vertical equity, I'm not sure if the audience totally understands that, but it measures the degree to which higher value properties are assessed similarly to lower value properties.
Yes.
Now, from what I saw on that data, they suggested, as you said, regressivity, which means that lower value properties, in a sense, are being unfairly treated, not unfairly treated, but there's some unfairness in how much the lower value properties are being assessed compared to the higher values. And really, we've hardly made the assessments from what I can see. I mean, we barely made it in the few years that we made it. And we were just on the border of making that. There were 2 metrics and we barely made it this year. And we only made it on 1 of 2 metrics.
Yes.
That measure regressivity, really.
Yes.
So my question is, what do you have some ideas of what may be causing that, and then some ideas about how to address this issue?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
This is a great question, and we report these statistics because we want to make ourselves accountable, and it helps us prioritize where we need to do our work. So whenever we value a home, the key drivers of the valuation of a home are square feet, year of construction, location, whether it's had a renovation on it, size of lot, and then other factors like a qualitative factor. We think high-end homes, there's a qualitative factor in there that is hard for us to see because we don't have enough data to see it. And what's the qualitative factor? So the home that I'm coming to you from tonight, we had a renovation done a few years ago in the kitchen, and a redone kitchen. There are things that go on inside houses that are hard for us to see that can affect sales prices, especially in the higher end of the spectrum. And so how do we deal with that? We think we need to find ways to get qualitative information better. We think we also will need to do more slicing and dicing of running different models with higher end properties than with average or lower end ones. We think that might be one of the factors that drives it. Because when we look at where our communities, where are other places where we're still having trouble, we see this in places like New Trier. We see it in other places like Barrington that have high-end homes, and there's some of those qualitative things that go inside it. So how we can do this? We're trying to work with the realtors to get better data. Sometimes they don't want to share that data with us, but we can also do better field work. What does that mean? We have a field inspection team that goes out into communities to make sure that the information that we have is accurate. Are the number of square feet that we have for homes reflecting the real number of square feet they have, or have we underestimated them, especially for high-end homes that might have been renovated? These are the kinds of things that if we don't have good data going into the model can spit out things that lead to mismeasurement and inaccuracy. In some communities, I don't include Oak Park here, some communities have not done a good job of reporting building permits to us. This is the case in New Trier. So we're really going to be focusing work with satellite imagery, discrepancies between what we see in imagery versus what's reported to us, so that we can get to the bottom of these discrepancies, so we can be more accurate, because that's serving the average everyone else in the system better. The system should not be regressive, and we try to fix it.
If I could address a couple things regarding that too. I remember when I met Fritz before he won the election in 2018, I said the hardest thing is going to be trying to value 1.8 million properties with less than 300 people. But one of the things, given the sort of mass system we have, I'm reminded of the time when I worked in Berwyn Township. Some of the neighborhoods in Berwyn are a lot easier to assess because the houses are very, very similar on a lot of those blocks. If you look at some of the places in Oak Park, with especially the higher value homes, they're all kind of unique and different. And to try to create a formula, I commend Fritz for trying to improve it, because I think we need to improve it as much as we can. But I think it's always going to be more difficult it's always going to be easier, shall we say, to, I think, assess a place like some of those neighborhoods in Berwyn and some of the more unique style properties in Oak Park. That's one thing. There is something else I think that needs to be pointed out, which is sort of countervailing towards some of the regressivity, and that's exemption. You know, we got homeowner exemptions, for example. Any owner-occupied property can get a homeowner exemption. In Oak Park, it's around $1,300 this year. And it's $1,300 whether you own a little condo or whether you own a mansion. And so some of the smaller value properties, you know, to the extent to which there is some regressivity, sometimes it's partially made up by the fact that, you know, I saw a property owner today who forgot his homeowner exemption. He's got his exemption now and his bill's zero, for example. Because the exemption, you know, the value was pretty low, and all of it was wiped out actually by the exemption. So I think that's, you know, it's not to say we shouldn't try to get the values right in the first place, but I think the system has a little bit of a self-correction in terms of these exemptions.
And Elizabeth, I think the last thing we're really trying to correct this. It's something within our influence is appeals. The more that we can get things right the outset, the better everyone is served, because with each iteration of appeals, it tends to make the system more regressive. Because if you look at before we came into the office, we found that for a $250,000 home versus $1 million home or plus, $1 million home plus homes are 3 times more likely to appeal than the $250,000 home. And they were 3 times more likely to be successful at the $1 million level than the $250,000. And the decrease in valuation from the appeal was larger on the larger homes than the smaller ones. So we are really looking at what we can do in our processes to eliminate that kind of bias. The real key is making sure that we do a good job from the outset so that other people who are doing appeals don't whittle that away and increase the regressivity, because each step of appeal we get increases the regressivity of the overall system.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And also, as I recall, the percentage of appeals is much higher in Cook County than in many other counties.
Yes, it's a really a grotesque anomaly in the U.S. About low single digit percentage of properties appeal in many large areas of the United States, but it's well into the double digits in Cook County as a legacy of a system that has malfunctioned for so long and was not trusted. And so we know it takes a long time to build that.
And I might add, it's also a legacy, I think, of just really high property taxes in Illinois. We're one of the, one or two highest, us in New Jersey, I think. I don't know what the New Jersey appeal rate is, but I know part of the reason people file appeals through my office isn't, maybe they think the value is wrong, but mostly they're struggling with their bill.
That's right. The numbers are, we have the highest property taxes in the nation, amongst the highest here in Illinois.
Thank you very much. Ron, let's turn over to you for our 4th question from the panel.
Sure. Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Voice, for organizing this this panel. I'm fortunate in I'm being the last person, so a lot of I had some questions here. Some of them have sort of been answered. One of them I used to, as I said, worked for CTBA, or as Josh said, and I remember this was Houlihan was just running for mayor, and we had people come in who told us about rigging and all kinds of things going on, and they wanted us to fix it. And the rigging was occurring through the Board of Appeals, or Board of Review, I guess it is. So one of my questions was for Mr. Kaegi, and it has given you know, I think you've been touching on this. Given the numerous property tax breaks and loopholes on commercial relative to residential real estate, because that led me to look at the pattern in Cook County. I saw the shift from commercial to residential over a period of time, and I said, "Geez, this is not good." And I tried to get some press on that, and then of course later on, the Tribune came out with, I think it was 2017 or whatever. They finally some reporting was done on what was going on. So I don't want to. I know and I was very happy that you were elected, Mr. Kaegi, because I think you know, and from what you've said, we're having some real improvements. But I'm wondering, given the what I consider to be legalized corruption, frankly, where we have some of our most powerful elected officials making money from commercial property tax appeals. What is the hope? And you've mentioned that, well, the board, you and Ali, Mr. ElSaffar both mentioned that things could be, some of even the reforms that you've put in place could be overturned by appeals through the Board of Review. And you know, we're in a state, and while I'm at it, I make maybe a pitch for the fair tax. I know it's kind of a no-brainer, I would think, for most people in Illinois, but we're in a state where we're among the 10 most regressive state and local taxes among the states, where our top 1% pay about half of what the bottom 20% pay as a share of income. That's, you know, property sales, you know, all the sources for state and local income. Now, the fair tax would help that, you know, by changing that and hopefully raise money for much needed programs. But part of, you know, the problem we're facing is that, as people have pointed out, the inequities of basing a tax system on property tax. And if you also have inequities in commercial residential and then between the residential, that exacerbates that. So I guess I would make a two-part question to both of you, just to shorten things up here a little bit. What is the hope of, you know, what can be done to try and, you know, lessen the tendency for the commercial properties, the large properties to get these big breaks and thereby increase the tax burden for all of us? So that's sort of the, you know, what I call the institutional problem with how that's been working. And the other part is more of a general question is, you know, what can we do to just in general why can't we have a progressive property tax? You know, and why do we have to base all of our property tax on real estate property? I mean, most of the wealth is in financial wealth. So, you know, I'm pushing the South Street tax and other things to try and get at that. But you know, so I know that it's beyond your scope. But just on the real estate end of it, we really do need to, I think, you know, there's a lot of room, just as we're trying to do with the fair tax, to make that progressive. I mean, why don't we, you know, tax mansions at a higher rate and tax, you know, high-end corporate, you know, real estate at a higher rate?
Ali, you want to take a swing at some of this, or should I? How would you want?
I'll be happy to start. A couple things. First of all, the property tax is not related to your ability to pay, and that's a problem for a lot of folks, especially that you can lose your job and have a big tax increase. It is part of the problem with relying so much on property taxes. We've talked for years about doing tax swaps and that sort of thing, but it seems like it hasn't reduced our property taxes in Illinois very much. I would say a couple things regarding this, you know, question of progressivity. There is, you know, the Cook County Ordinance has a degree of progressivity. It was something you asked about earlier on when you were asking if apartment buildings are assessed at 25% of market value, and they're not, but commercial property is. And that was decided many, many years ago. I've been here 19 years, and it's a lot longer than 19 years that we've had this sort of disparity in the county ordinance about what they call the level of assessment. What does that mean? That means if you have two properties, a $100,000 commercial property and a $100,000 residential property right next door to each other, the level of assessment for residential is 10%. That means its assessed value is going to be $10,000. The level of assessment for the commercial property is going to be 25%, or it's going to have an assessed value of $25,000, 2.5 times of the same value property. Now, when we all go through the tax appeal system, oftentimes we don't end up at 10% and at 25%. I looked recently, you know, every couple of years, the Illinois Department of Revenue, every year, when they create the state equalizer, they have to do a sales ratio study for each to see, you know, how close to 10% are we? How close to 25% are we? And the last one I looked at, which was, I think it was last year, as I recall, residential were around 9% in terms of actuality by their measurements, comparing sales to assessment. And commercial was around 21, 22. I thought that the commercial was, a little farther off than the residential. But my only point is that, there's already in place something like what you're talking about. It's not so much within small, lower value homes and higher value homes, but it is between residential property and commercial property. And I don't know if,
Well, I'm sorry. Well, I don't know. Fritz, do you want to jump in? Or?
So you had a two-handed question there. Let me address the different pieces. With respect to once we think we've really marshaled a lot of data, and as I showed you in the presentation, we show people how we get to our numbers on all these properties, and in many cases we really have extraordinary evidence. So I think an acid test in Oak Park would be some of the big apartment buildings that have not only recently transacted, but it's a public record what they told their lenders and the public and the SEC they thought their buildings were worth. Okay, so if Goldman Sachs is telling the SEC, telling its lenders that they think the building is worth over 100 million and they bought it for 100 million, you got to have a damn good reason for why you're not assessing it. And I think for buildings like that, that will be an acid test to ask really hard questions to other people if they take it away from market value. You have to have a really good reason for moving away from market values like that and make everyone pay more. You just got it, because you're distorting that mirror. The assessment system is a mirror. You're distorting it. Why are you doing that? On what basis? On what data? And we're upfront. I think everyone should be upfront about the data they use and getting their numbers. And ultimately, they're accountable to you and the public.
Yeah.
With respect to property taxes, you make such a good point. People think because Ali and I, that we're assessors, that we like property taxes. Couldn't be further from the truth. Property taxes are a regressive way of financing government. And the reason why is multifold. First of all, property taxes, they originate from biblical times, from the Domesday Book, 1,000 years ago. And this reflects a time when the economy was based on bricks and mortar. A farm, a home, factory was all the wealth there was. Our economy has moved so far beyond that, like you said. And COVID has only accelerated the trends that have been in place for a long time, right? We're all doing this over Zoom. Think of what COVID has accelerated the forces that were already underway. What it's doing to retail space, what it's doing to office space. The less and less of the economy is represented by bricks and mortar. If we think about, real estate values have almost certainly gone down because of COVID. And yet the US stock market is up 15% this year. The bond market, if you look at the 10-year treasury, is up like double digits this year. So you have some wealth that's grown with COVID, but real estate wealth has declined. And yet it's that small fraction of real estate wealth that is being asked to cover the cost of our school system and government. Most property taxes are for schools. So this is a fundamental societal problem that needs to be addressed now. COVID is making it an emergency. We can't continue to ask smaller and shrinking fraction of the economy that's bricks and mortar to cover the cost of things that are as important and fundamental as education. Because doing that drives incredible segregation and disparities. If you look, there are 132 municipalities in Cook County. The top 20 in rates all majority Black. And their average rates are 3 to 5 times the level in the rest of the county. I know many of us here who are on this call today are, you know, we're fortunate to have wealth that we can invest, and a lot of us know about the value of investing in index funds because they have, you know, they generate better returns, they have lower costs. Well, think about how much of your return will be eaten up if you pay a 6 or 7% property tax instead of the 2 and change that we pay in Oak Park. It eats up any potential to compound your wealth. And that is what we have in a giant swath of Cook County. Like, more than 500,000 people are in places where those rates are that high. Totally destructive to wealth. And the only reason that that exists is that even if our assessments were perfect, if everyone could agree on them and they're that perfect mirror, you'd still have that disparity. Why? The fundamental fact is that in many communities, real estate value has shrunk to a very small amount. But you still have to spread the local equivalent of that 220 million across the shrinking base. The way you change that is you have to change the way that schools are financed. That's the only way you can get that 220 million, like in Oak Park, to shrink. The way we do this is you can get a state source, a new state source of revenues for the school districts, or a new federal source. The question with the fair tax, you opened, Ron, with that gives the state another tool to do that. And one of the arguments for the fair tax is that, wait a second, why are we going to ask part of the economy that's earning no income because they're unemployed, or they own property that's earning no income because they've had to shut down? Why are we asking for them to pay for schools when the state could have another tool to raise revenue from the folks who earned that 15% return in the stock market this year and the bond market this year instead? That's the fundamental question with the fair tax. Now, people raise legitimate questions. Is that money that you could be raising through the fair tax going to reach our schools? And that's up to us as citizens to make sure that it does, and to make sure that our folks in Springfield hold the line on how they use that money. It's up to us to tell them what the priorities are for spending. That's us. That's us as Oak Parkers and citizens. But I think, you know, the state is like a second best source of revenue for schools. The best is the federal government. And this was a pillar of the civil rights movement that, you know, A. Philip Randolph, when he spoke in the March on Washington, he said there are 5 pillars of civil rights in this country, and it's not only the right to vote, the right to housing, but it's also a right to health care, and it's federal support for education, for educating the disadvantaged. This is part of supporting the common welfare of American citizens. And to our shame, our country had opened this up only a crack under LBJ, and it has not moved since. We spend about $15 billion at the federal level on supporting K through 12 education through the Title I Act. That amount has not changed in dollars since the last decade, and it's been a shrinking part of GDP ever since LBJ left the White House. It's a disgrace. And $15 billion is nothing for the federal government. It's the cost of one Gerald Ford class aircraft carrier.
Listen,
that's how much the federal government supports to support K through 12. So, and it can make a real big difference in rates and those differentials. So I'll give you an example. The CPS, Chicago Public Schools, gets $300 million in Title I. The school levy for the CPS is $3 billion. The federal government doubled or tripled Title I spending, and the school districts are allowed to pass that on to taxpayers. That could be a double-digit percentage decline in the CPS levy. It would be even a bigger decline in some of these South Suburban, West Suburban school districts. That's where the real money is, because an economy like we have today, where more of it is not in brick and mortar and it's done through things like Zoom, and it's best done at the federal level because people make a good argument. Hey, you know, if it's at Illinois, I'm just going to move to Florida. But if the federal government is supporting our schools, that all Americans are part of supporting that cost.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to interrupt there. Again, another extremely important issue, and very important to hear about that. But I do want to leave a few minutes. We have a hard close at 9:30, and I want to leave a few minutes to check in with Anisha to see if, Anisha, we got some questions from.
Yes. So we have the same, we have 3 questions. 2 of them are kind of small. So the questions are small. I don't know what the answers, if you guys have them. The third one is long. Maybe you've discussed it in a different way. So let's go with the first 2, which are short. Okay. What is the diversity breakdown of home purchases in the last 10 years? Diversity, so I'm guessing they mean racial and family and stuff like that. And the second one, does closet space count towards square footage of living space?
The second one is yes.
I thought so too. Okay.
The first one, you're talking about an Oak Park. I don't know the
I think
numbers.
so.
Maybe
I think they mean
Oak Park. And
yeah.
Fritz, do you know the numbers of? I don't know if anybody.
I don't, and actually, I think this would be a great thing. We should do another session with the Oak Park Regional Housing Center because they for sure would know that.
Yeah.
And I don't know that. We have the census being done right now, and hopefully it's been done accurately in Oak Park. So we'll be able to find that data in the next year. But I don't know the answer to that question.
My only sense is that I think that African Americans as a percentage of renters is higher than as a percentage of homeowners. I believe that's the case, but the exact numbers I don't know.
Okay, and the third question
if I could just, I'm sorry. There's also the issue of economic diversity. I don't know if that's part of the question, but that has been a big concern for many of us. And you know, it relates to the issue of whether you can build yourself out of the property tax problem by luxury high rises. And so you guys, my guess is we're losing economic diversity.
And I would tend to agree.
I don't know the answer to that, but you know, one of the things that is hard when you talk to people who are building new housing units is they say that the average cost to build a new unit is somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000 or $300,000. And when you're talking about that kind of price tag, that is, you know, if we have to assume that it takes 3 years of income to afford something, you know, the price of something like that, then you're saying you need $100,000 of income to support like a new unit. We got to figure out a way. What that tells me is, first of all, we have to figure out a way to make units cheaper to build. Second of all, we gotta really work on saving the affordable units out there that are, you know, priced cheaper than that. We have to work really hard, and that's a question in Oak Park. That means preserving our affordable rental stock, preserving our housing. I think we got to find other ways to create more units more cheaply. And I don't know if that's the so-called accessory dwelling unit, building more coach houses. But we got to figure out ways to get more supply out there at a cheaper rate.
It's just construction, not land.
It's both. I think when I talk to people, it's land plus unit cost of construction, which includes labor and materials and other things. And I know there are ways but we can look into codes to make things cheaper. But that's just too high for where the American economy is today. Most families don't make that kind of money.
I don't know if Gary wants to jump in, but he had this idea of the older apartments without elevators. We use them for affordable housing. Gary?
I'm willing to comment on this, is that.
Do we have one last question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I did want to jump in. Thank
quit.
you. I think Anisha had one last question. I do want to give the people writing in a shot.
I'll just read it because I'll just read it. This is definitely not me. I grew up in Oak Park and moved back into the community 2 years ago. When I tell people I pay $31K in property tax on a 2,000 square foot condo, I always get the same incredulous look. Are you stupid? Actually, I'm a highly educated, high income earner who bought into a new property when taxes were, I can't really, okay, something to keep, it was not very clear about what the taxes were. And to keep myself and future generations living in the community, especially considering that property taxes alone are enough to render any perceived benefits such as great schools are not worth it. Kind of vague at the end.
I think that's to me, that's a basic question. I think I know the condability that's being referred to in this question, but it's a basic question of the overall level of taxation in the community, particularly because it's very expensive to live in the community like Oak Park. And there are people who say, I remember I talked to somebody a couple months ago who said, I could afford $30,000 a year in taxes, but I'm sort of morally opposed to paying that much just to live in a particular place. That's part of, I think, that question. But the other thing I think is, I think this property is a new property. One of the more difficult things that prospective buyers have, there's a new condo or something like that, sometimes it can be very difficult to know what the taxes are going to be. If somebody says, there used to be a rule of thumb, which is that the taxes will be 2% of purchase price, which may be true in a place like the city of Chicago, but it's definitely not true in a place like Oak Park. So if you come in thinking it's going to be 2% and it ends up being 3.5% or something like that, you can have a situation like that question I have a feeling might have had. So anyway, that's partly that's education, but partly it's just a level of taxation we have in the community.
Yep, and just building on that, I mean, first of all, this would be true for anyone who's listening or watching today. First of all, make sure that you should always look at the assessed value for your home. What market value is being assumed for your home? Does that reflect what you think the actual resale price of that property is? If the market value that we're assuming is really different from what you could actually get, is much higher, then that's the kind of thing that you should try to, through the appeals process, try to resolve. We probably don't have the right data on it, or there's something might be wrong with our valuation model in that case. We're trying to eliminate situations where people with the same kind of property are being treated differently, but you should always check to see, are you being taxed in the same way that someone with a similar building is? Because if you're being assessed at a higher level than someone who has the same kind of property as you, then you have a case to make that, hey, I should be treated the same way as another person. But assuming those are not the case, Ali makes a good point on one thing. This is the level of taxation. How much tax are we asking the average person in Oak Park to carry through our spending? And we can all be good. The key to controlling that is being good citizens here in holding the line on spending, and making sure that our school districts get other sources of revenue besides property taxes, so the property owners don't have to carry that load. The other part of the equation is, let's make sure that our base fairly reflects the market value of all properties. All of our properties are interconnected when it comes to assessed value. So you shouldn't think about your assessed value in isolation. Think about what is total assessed value in our community, because if there is one part that we're not assessing correctly, saying under assessing them, then you're picking up the freight for them. So we're trying to do our job at the assessor's office to make sure that we're assessing everyone fairly, so that you're only paying your fair share of that $220 million levy. And we do that by making sure that everyone is assessed fairly. That's why I say our assessments are interconnected in Cook County and in Oak Park.
I'm going to chime in here. I promised our viewers that we wouldn't go past 9:30, and I want to keep that